Hi there everyone, and welcome to another TouchDesigner tutorial. In today's tutorial, we're going to look at 3D raycasting effects like this using the new Ray Pop in TouchDesigner. What this allows us to do is to create a light source and basically block that light using 3D objects in our scene. And we can also see here that I'm using a sort of an interesting point-based render for this, which I'll show you in this tutorial as well. The inspiration for this tutorial came from watching this 2D raycasting with TouchDesigner Pops tutorial by Bitemaps, and I'd recommend going to check this out as well if you're getting really into raycasting. This one will take what we learned in that 2D version and apply it to a 3D scene, so we can actually manipulate the scene in 3D like we see here. And I'll also show you some post-production techniques to get this sort of window box effect. Before starting today's video, I wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who has supported this channel by liking and subscribing, as well as folks who've signed up for the Patreon. These videos take time to create, and your support means that I've been able to create more videos and also better videos, often in dialogue and in response to topics and questions that you have had. If you haven't already signed up to this YouTube channel, click the like and subscribe button, and if you have the capacity, go over to Patreon and check out all the goodies I have there. Thanks a lot. I'm going to start off this network with a grid pop. This is what I'm going to use to position all of the objects that are going to occlude my light. So what I'll do is I'll also create a box. This is the occluding shape, which I'm going to copy. And before I do that, I'm going to scale this up to a uniform scale of 5 for the grid. I'm going to take the columns down to 5, the rows down to 5, and also the slices down to 5. So now we have a 5 by 5 by 5 cube. We can bring this in to a copy. And now we should have our cube. I'm also going to turn this down a little bit. There we go. Later on, I'm going to displace the position of this sort of 3D box cube, but for now, we're going to leave it like this. The important thing about the Ray Pop is that we have two inputs. We have one input that is going to be our ray geometry, and this is going to be the geometry that's generating the light paths that are shooting out. We also have a collision geometry, and this is going to be the geometry that is affecting those light paths. So if there's an intersection between this geometry and a light path, it's going to occlude, reflect, or stop the light. To fit this together, I'm going to create a sphere because we're working in 3D. This sphere is going to shoot off a bunch of light vectors, which we will affect with this collision layer. To understand better how these lines of light are being emitted, let's go into View on the sphere. If we right-click and go to Display Attribute Vectors and look at the normals, we'll see that we have all these little arrows, and these arrows are representing the direction that our lines will be shooting off in terms of our ray pop. Let's also look at the box to make sure that we are going to have faces that will actually manipulate that light in a meaningful way. Let's take a look at that normal as well. And what we can see is each face basically has a vertex that's going to push that light away. So basically it's like a mirror. So when light hits, it's going to reflect back. So this is absolutely fine. I'm going to plug my sphere into the top inlet of the ray. And I'm also going to put my copy with all these cubes into the bottom layer. We can see that there is already an effect, a bit different to the effect that I described earlier, but we can see that something is happening. Let's take a bit of a look at what happens if we change some parameters here. So first off, let's try changing that scale. We can see that as I grow that sphere, when it's outside the bounds of that system, we basically are not occluding that sphere at all. And when it is within the bounds of that system, so when it's smaller, coming from the center, it's shooting out and it's intersecting with all of these geometries, which are essentially blocking the light. So we can see each of these sort of geometric slices coming out is a light path. In the ray pop, to visualize this a bit better, we can turn on connect points. And so now we can see how this is shooting out. If we were to merge our two layers together, we can see it's kind of creating this outward trajectory until a path of light hits a cube. If we go into our sphere and add in, for example, more points, we'll see that that gets more dense. If we keep going and going, we can move that up and down. And likewise, we can see if I translate that sphere, the pattern looks very different. Kind of a big translate there. Let's move that all the way across. So we can see how this is shooting out these paths of light. What I actually want to do is change my sphere type to grid, and then I have a bit more control over these rows and columns. And this is already kind of a cool effect. We can apply some other things in the ray pop. So for example, we can turn on any hit. We can also switch between having our connect points turned on or off. And the difference here is basically if we're drawing lines or a more detailed geometry. So let's keep it on connect points for now. One more thing we can do is we can create a bounding box. An example of why we might need this is, let's say we have a grid with just a few points in it. We can see that even though we're shooting off lots of layers from our sphere, we have lots and lots of light vectors here that could do something, but basically they're only intersecting with objects that can be intersected with in the scene. And right now we only have these few objects in the scene and nothing else to interact with. So to get around this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another box. I'm going to match it to the uniform scale of my grid. So copy that reference over, and I'm going to merge it with my copy. So now what we can see is that this is now completely filled up with lines. As I start adding back in some geometry, we'll see how that occlusion steps up a little more. We can see that we have these sort of blocked out paths where there's an intersection with some of these rectangles. Now, something that I just want to quickly go back on is I earlier had this any hit switched to on. We actually want to have this off when we have a big surrounding object, because basically all the lines are going to intersect with that box at some point. So let's just turn that off. Let's view that in the 3D viewer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try out a few things. So let's just try turning up this box size. And we can see how that occlusion changes as the box size gets bigger, because obviously there are more areas that are going to get in the way of that path of light. I want to mix up a few things here, and I'm going to go ahead and just delete this merge because we only need that for visualization purposes. I'm going to neaten this up a little bit by putting this in the top and this in the bottom. You can see obviously how there's a difference there between this and this, so it's kind of up to you how you choose to position your system. For now, we'll keep it like this. And the next thing I want to do is I want to manipulate the point position of my shape. So before the copy, I want to put in a noise. And let's turn up that amplitude. Let's do it up to like 3. And let's animate our translate 4D with an abs time dot seconds times 0.1. Okay. So that's kind of a nice effect. I also want to add some rotation to our blocks. And what I'm going to do is add in another noise. On the output tab, I'm going to go and change this output scope to ROT. And I'm going to change the amplitude here to 360. Now on this copy under template, let's turn on this template rotate and bring in ROT. So now we can see that we have this kind of wild rotation. Let's actually look at that in terms of this grid. So this is a bit over the top for me, and basically what's happening here is it's being rotated by this movement of P as well. So it's looking up the P attribute, which we're changing in terms of the position, and then also scaling the rotation to that. We can actually just rearrange these. So I'm going to take my first output of this grid to modify the rotation, and I'll just call this ROT just so we have a name to easily see, and then this will be pos. So now we should see that these are moving nice and smooth. We're animating our position already, so let's also go in and slowly animate our rotation with another abs times dot seconds times 0.1. And we should be able to see that these boxes are now rotating in a sort of nice way. In the viewer, we can see that in some areas where we're kind of close to the center, we can actually make out that rotation of those boxes, which is a really cool effect. And obviously you can sort of play around if you have the merged or unmerged factor in your output. I like using the merge for the next step that we're going to do, which is this post-production phase where we create a sort of picture frame that this all fits into. But if you want a more standalone scene, you can just have it like this and it looks very cool also. Let's drag this into a geo. And let's build out our render network. So we're going to add in a render top. We're going to add in a camera viewport. I tend to always go for the camera viewport from the palette these days. To link that up to the render, let's just drag that into our camera slot. I want to create a light. And I also want to create a material, and I want to use a PBR. On the PBR, let's turn down the metallic and the roughness until we get something that looks kind of good. Let's also home our camera. I'm going to split my screen, go to panel view, create an out, and I'm going to scale my render as well to 1280 by 1280. And I'm also going to go out and change that in the parent to match my resolution. Something you can do to speed up these changes is you can actually link these parameters. So you could say parent.width, parent.height. And now, if you ever bring up these parent parameters, your render is going to automatically scale to your width and height of your parent, which is a nice, easy way of making these changes. I'm also going to bring in an environment light, and I'll just add in a noise as my environment map, which will change later. And right now we should have something that looks sort of like this. The final thing I'm going to do before I get into a bit more of the post-production stuff is in my camera viewport under camera, I'm just going to change this panel comp to ... which allows me to rotate using my panel. And I'm also going to right click and bring up these open parent parameters. Under the panel tab, I'm going to toggle on middle and right. And this is going to allow me to use my middle mouse to zoom in and out and my right click to move the object around. If I want to home it, I can press H and it's going to take me back to that homed position. Okay, this is looking good. The first thing I want to do in terms of creating the effect that we saw earlier is I want to add in a couple of things before I go to this geo. The first thing I'm going to do is in Ray, I'm going to switch off this connect points, and it's going to now look more like a sort of a 3D texture, which is kind of a cool effect. It is pretty blocky. It's got kind of jagged edges, so this isn't going to be the effect that I actually end up using. What I'm going to use this for is a method of actually creating a bunch of points. And to do that, I'm going to insert a sprinkle operator. And so we can see right now that's already looking pretty cool. I want to really up these sprinkle points. I'm going to start off with 100,000. And ideally, you're going to be in somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 to make this kind of really dense. So this is the first step. And we can see that's kind of cool already. We're getting quite a lot of texture on our shape. And this is really why I keep in this box that's merged. If we have this off, we don't get that same kind of constrained picture frame effect, which I really like. So that's the first step. The second step is we're going to create a box to put this in. So I'm going to create a SOP box. We're going to switch it up a bit and use some SOPs. I'm going to match the size of this grid. And the reason I'm using a SOP is because I want to use a clip to remove one of the sides of my object. I want to remove the side that's facing towards us. I'm going to press 1 on this direction here. What we can see is we're slicing it in that direction. And in terms of the distance, I want to bring it up just so we take off that final edge. Okay, there we go. You can see how you get that carved look when you get that face. The reason I'm using SOPs for this is I haven't found a way that's as quick of doing this in POPs yet. I'm sure there is. I'm just doing this in SOPs just for ease of use. And I'm now going to convert this back into a POP. And I'm going to add another geo. And let's make sure that we actually have a side that is cut off. There we go. That's the cut off side. So I'm actually going to go into this geo and rotate it in the Y 180 degrees, minus 180 degrees. I'm also just going to bring this up very slightly in scale, just so we have that sort of edge. Okay, I'm going to apply another PBR. I'm going to bring down these two layers. And I'm going to do some manipulations to my light, both in terms of moving this sphere around and also moving this light around. I'm going to create a noise chop. In channel, I'm going to give it the channel names X, Y, and Z. I'm also going to turn off time slice, and I'll turn the period up to 6 and the amplitude up to, let's say, 3. I'm going to maneuver this onto the translate for my sphere. This is going to move that light around. You can kind of see how that's occluding differently. And I'm also going to control my actual light with these parameters. So let's find that actual light. Move the translate, X, Y, and Z. See, that's all moving around in there. And one more thing is I want to rotate that light. So I'm going to create an angle. I'm going to switch this to quaternions, and I'll bring that into my light as well. And we'll apply this to the X, Y, and Z. It's not going to make a huge difference to the visual look, but overall it does kind of just create a bit more depth to that light moving around with that central position. A bit more playing with these PBRs to get an effect that you kind of like. So I want it a bit darker on this cube. So play around with things like the occlusion. And I also want to play around with this just a little bit. You can also create colors on it if you want to. I don't want that. But if you do, then you can obviously apply that as your environment light. And this is more or less the effect. What I would do as an extra step to post-production is sort of separate out these points from this background shape and kind of process them differently. Like I'd have some bloom and maybe some blur on those points to create a bit more of a depth of field. I'd also play around with how powerful my computer is in terms of how many points I could have in that sprinkle. Let's try 500,000, or bringing it down 100,000, and just seeing how these different things kind of affect that visualization. You get a kind of almost dither type effect using this. And you could think about playing with that and creating this, manipulating a grid of points rather than a sprinkled grid of points. So these are all some things that you can sort of try out. You could also play around with manipulating the scene with different geometries. So you could put a sphere in instead of a box. Let's see what's going to happen here. I'm also going to turn down that uniform scale. And we have quite a high ratio there, so also turn that down, maybe to 2. And again, these effects are all about how much your computer can actually process at any one time. But that is kind of an interesting effect as well. You could obviously try any kind of geometry. You could also experiment with putting a 3D object into your scene. I'm not going to copy this lots of times because it's already quite a dense shape. I'm actually going to delete some data from the shape under the thin tab of our delete. Just randomly delete some bits there, and I can just bring that in and replace my spheres in this merge. And what I'm also going to do is transform this so it's rotated towards me. Wow, this is going really slow. This would be a good time to turn down my sprinkle. So let's do 50,000 there. Okay, so I had to play around with this a little bit to get my 3D shape to actually visualize without kind of killing my computer. And what I've done here is I've taken that initial 3D object, I've transformed it just so it's rotated to face towards me. I've used the thin attribute on delete to remove a bunch of points. You can see there, I can change how detailed it is. And this basically means we just have the sort of the outline of that shape in cubes. I've also just plugged it into our rotation and noise position just so we have a bit more variation there. And this could sort of be an interesting effect to play with. But for now, I think it's probably better to stick with maybe more simple geometries of this kind of method, even though this could be a super cool effect. And I'd be excited to see what folks do with this kind of setup. I'm moving back to my grid system, and let's put that position back on so it's moving around. And yeah, I hope you like this effect, and I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.